Hello and welcome. Thank you for stopping by to check out my talk on the communist student movement of the 1960s, ignoring Marxist evil on display. First, we'll look at the thesis statement here. Although some in the 1960s echoed the Marxist mantra that communism is inevitable and superior to capitalism, even then communism was on display as a failed form of government, as can be seen through the history of its tendency to produce tyranny, economic oppression, and human rights abuses. So how are we going to kind of look at that thesis statement? We're going to look at the student movement voices. Who were the people speaking into the voices, or speaking into this cultural movement called the SDS and the student movement? Now, as with any cultural movement, there are lots of voices, maybe even lots of leaders. We're talking about a whole decade here. So I chose these two particular voices as those speaking into the new left because I found a quote that kind of inspired my whole project, and I'll give you that quote here in a couple of seconds. But that's why I chose those two voices. What I'll do is I'll tell you about them, and then I will kind of prove to you that they were pretty important. They were among the top leaders throughout the decade. Okay, and then the next thing we'll look at is the evil of communism on display in the 60s. Everybody knows that Mao and Khrushchev had evils that were perpetrated within their regimes. The question is, could the students that were being told by the SDS and the New Left that communism was the answer, could they have had access to information about the ills of Khrushchev and Mao's communist regimes so that they could rebut those teachings? So could the average student have known? And the last question, is it history? Is it history, or is this something that we might be able to take something from it today? I'm going to touch lightly on most of this. The full talk will happen on ACE Day, which will be gone by the time you see this. But we only have 15 minutes here, so I'm going to just kind of touch lightly. You'll see a lot more information here than what I actually say, and that's okay. I'm sure you'll be fine with that. Okay, so is it true? Here's this quote that kind of inspired the talk. Forming the core of the 1960s countercultural movement, the New Left Students for a Democratic Society was a radical organization that aspired to overthrow America's democratic institutions, remake its government in a Marxist image. I've always heard that communism was bad, and here's a quote that said it was bad. Was it really bad? I don't know. Let's have a look. We're gonna look at that next. But first, we're gonna look at what was being taught to the students. Okay, we'll look at the SDS. Take me to your leaders, the SDS and the New Left. Here's the SDS first. Their Port Huron statement. It was their initial publication, laid out their doctrinal guidelines of the New Left, conceded failure of communism, and yet it still promoted communism as the solution to the problems that were being experienced by especially those in America, and prioritized liberals and socialists as prospective members, encouraged incitement of controversy as a primary means of spreading their ideologies. So here's the Port Huron statement. Each one of these next slides proves one of the points that I just said. This is the fact that it's their initial publication. Here it is that they were holding up communism as the answer and saying, the old answer. Well, everybody might say, or somebody might say, well, communism didn't work, and then the answer from the communists might be, well, they didn't do it right in the past. Well, this is exactly their answer in this slide. Next slide here is they're advocating for socialist control or communal communist control, government control of the means of commerce and the means of major resources and means of production. So there we go. Here's their some of their guiding principles. This is one of the lists you find in their statement. Here's on page 61 and 2. You can see number 4 and 5 say a new left must include liberals and socialists, and 5, the new left must start controversy across the land. That's the way they wanted to spread their ideology, by starting controversy. If that doesn't say something, I don't know what does. Okay, so is it true? We've proven these things to you? It's initial publication of the SDS, the Port Huron Statement, so it was an important document. It laid out the doctrinal guidelines for the new left, which we'll look at next. It conceded failure of communism. It continued to promote communism. It prioritized liberals and socialists and encouraged incitement of controversy as a primary means of spreading the ideologies. And we'll look later, one of the things that they looked for in their liberals and socialists, it was the venue was the university. So is it true? Yeah, I think it was. Michelle thinks it was. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Mrs. Former President, First Lady. Okay, New Left. So here's two leading voices. There's a lot here, and so I'm going to just kind of browse through it. Uh, this is a quote from American Counterculture that was required for the project, and here it is, that talk about the New Left. All right, so here's Charles Wright Mills, who was the guy on the left here. Charles Wright Mills was born 1916, died 1962. He is the one who wrote the letter to the New Left, in which you find this idea here that we want this radical agency of change as that we find in the intellectuals, which is the educational people in education. So the primary desire for promotion of socialist change was through university campuses via Charles Wright Mills. Maddock, he is the other guy, the guy on the right here, Paul Maddock, prolific writer, over 100 publications. I'm going to read you just a piece. As you see, he's written 100 publications. That's where I lost count. So I'm going to read you just the highlighted portions here. An analysis of capitalist society permits no other conclusion than that communism is inevitable. Anyone who takes a hostile attitude to this dogma only illustrates the weaknesses of his understanding of economics, and he has actually nothing left to do but close up inside himself his will, his intelligence, and his consciousness must necessarily be clouded. And he goes on to talk about capitalist magic. So this quote reveals an intellectual context for his work in the 1960s. Paul Maddock, something else that was said in his work, 1967 work called Workers' Control. The goal of socialists was then and still is the abolition of the wage system, which implies the end of capitalism. So more evidence here that they were promoting the end of capitalism. Okay, so connecting them to the SDS and the New Left, Paul Maddock. Here's a quote from Marxists.org. That says that with the general changes of political scene and the reemergence of more radical thought in the 60s, Maddock made some more extensive and important contributions. One main work, Marx and Keynes, The Limits of the Mixed Economy from 1969, which was translated several languages, had quite an influence on the post-68 student movement. So he's definitely influential. Charles Wright Mills, kind of a lot more easily said because he created the term New Left and wrote the letter to the New Left, which was prolific. So check off on him. Next, so was the evil on display during the 60s? We're going to look at the evils and could the kids have known about them? So here's Mao and Khrushchev. I'm sure you know something about them. Mao's economic oppression, his great leap. He wanted to take all of his great 800 million people at that time and use it in conjunction with the industrial power that was available at that time and say, we're going to just leap ahead of all these Western civilizations. And during that planned economy, there were many people who were oppressed, one of which is Cui Wen Hua from this Forgotten Voices of Mao's Great Famine. And here in 1959, he says, at the time we were told that we had entered into communism and there would be no more private housing. The day before that happened, we were still living in our own house, but the day afterward, our house was turned into a granary for the collective. After that, we had to move from place to place, from one place to another on a regular basis. There was no peace in those days. So this quote is just one of many from the book that revealed the suffering experienced by millions due to Mao's planned economy. So Khrushchev's tyranny, religious persecution. There's a chronicle of the Estonian Lutheran Church by Altenurm here. He says, even though religion was deprecated for ideological reasons all through the existence of the Soviet Union, the intensity of the campaign peaked during the Khrushchev years. It could be claimed that a decisive blow to the social status of churches was struck in the 60s. So this quote reveals that there was large-scale religious persecution in Russia under Khrushchev during the 60s. So we kind of established, that wasn't very hard. We know that they were oppressive and that those were bad regimes. But they were happening in the 60s, and the students Could they have known about this? Yeah, they could. Yeah, have a look. Khrushchev's Soviet Union. How about New York Times? Is that kind of an off the beaten path source? No, this is like mainstream media. At least 10,000 churches and dozens of monasteries have been illegally liquidated. I'll fix that before I turn it in. Sorry about that. This shows information of failures of communism were as available as the major newspaper. I'm going to skip through these because we're getting low on time here. Nixon's major political speech during his campaign of 1960, in which he went um, uh, against Kennedy. He says he made a speech called "The Meaning of Communism" and decried all of the ills of communism, culminating in this final quote here, where he says that communist theory has now had a chance to prove itself by an experience extending over 2 generations in a great nation of huge human and material resources. So major political speeches, the newspaper, it's everywhere. Mao's China. Okay, here's today's paper about Mao's China. China's leap slowed by a limp. They're blaming their problems in agriculture on nature, but Western specialists believe that unfavorable natural conditions are not a sufficient explanation for the poor agricultural record. They attribute part of communist China's difficulties with the farm production to extreme collectivization of farming under the commune system. All right, how about the front page? Genocide in Tibet laid to red China by world jurists. June 20th, 1960, the New York Times ran a front page article entitled this. And they say the International Commission of Jurists asserted tonight that the Chinese communists were guilty of attempting a systematic extermination of Buddhists, the Buddhist religion in Tibet. So they should have known. They should have known. It was widely known, easily accessible. They should have been able to rebut that. So yes, they should have known. Here's our comic relief for a moment. Moment's gone. Okay, so that was then, right? People who lived through that say no. Here's a quote from Kurt Stanley, who lived through the 60s. He says, today's socialism is a direct descendant of the student radicalism of the 1960s. 60s radicals were enthusiasts of a violent socialist revolution. Bernie Sanders, anyone? I mean, he's not violent, but definitely there's in major political seats, we have representatives of communism and socialism. Bernie Sanders would be an example. So how could this have happened? Some believe that capitalism was a core problem, and the youth were looking for an answer. What I mean by that, a core problem that was underpinning the issues that we were dealing with in America in the 60s. And communism presented itself as a popular, progressive way forward. And yet those who accepted this conclusion were misled, rationalized away the truth of what communism had produced both in the past and in their own time, and they therefore returned to the sins of the past like dogs are returning to their vomit, instead of turning to the giver of all wisdom who gives liberally to all who ask. So encouragement from the Bible. Scripture warns us of forgetting about the mistakes of the past. In Psalms 26, it says, like a dog that returns to its vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. So God doesn't leave us, though, in our sin and folly. So even though maybe we have returned to the vomit like a dog, maybe we are a fool. Well, okay, that's all right. God's not just leaving you there and pointing and laughing. God says to you, if you lack wisdom, ask of me, and I give generously to all without reproach. So that's wisdom from the Bible. So we're running short on time here. I've kind of sped through all this. I hope you've enjoyed it. Here are my discussion questions. Were you convinced that the youth should have known about the failures of communism? You can go through and kind of pause and look at those newspaper articles, and all the links are there. What blaring thing did I miss in the project? Maybe there's something you saw that, man, you really missed this one counter argument, or you missed this one argument in favor of your proposition. And then what other ideas struck you as I went through the material? I guess those are kind of related, but maybe you had another idea that something I could have went through, or some line of thinking that I could have pursued that would have maybe helped the thesis be proven better. Well, I want to thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I look forward to all your comments, and we'll be having a good time talking back and forth. Thanks again for watching.